During the early morning hours of May 12, 2010, a fully serviceable state-of-the-art Airbus A330 jet impacted the Libyan desert sands while attempting to land at Tripoli International Airport. The accident would claim the lives of all 104 souls on board, bar one. Although officially classified as a CFIT, or controlled flight into terrain accident, the reason why it happened will prove both enlightening and fascinating, and highlight the existence of a fundamental physiological weakness which can potentially afflict any and all human pilots. Stay with me as I reveal the full story behind Afriqiyah Flight 771.
Calling out Mayday.
Afriqiyah Airways, deriving its name from the Arabic word for African, is a Libyan state-owned airline founded in 2001, which is based in Tripoli and serves destinations across Africa, Europe and the Middle East. Although the company's modern corporate image has transformed greatly since the period in question, for good reason. During the period of the mid-2000s, on foot of the direct intervention of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, the airline's fleet had sported a distinctive multicoloured 9999 livery on the tail of all its aircraft. This collection of nines referred to the date on which the Sirte Declaration was signed, marking the formation of the African Union, that being the 9th of September 1999, a visible statement to the world of what Gaddafi saw as being one of his proudest achievements. During 2010, the airline had demonstrated a modest turnover of about $138 million, employed just over 1,300 employees, and was carrying just under 2.5 million passengers. Having commenced operations with the single Boeing 737-200 back in 2001, by 2003 an all-Airbus fleet had been introduced, with Afriqiyah signing a memorandum of understanding for the purchase of 6 Airbus A320s and 3 A319s, with the option of an additional 5. Furthermore, with aspirations of expanding its long-haul operation, it had also signed an agreement for 3 Airbus A330-200s, with an option for an additional 3 to be taken up at a later date. The first of these A330s had been delivered during 2009 and was used to inaugurate new routes to Dakar, Kinshasa and Johannesburg in South Africa. And so it was that one of these 330s, registration 5 Alpha Oscar November Golf, found itself heading northward over the African continent towards Tripoli and the shores of the Mediterranean Sea during the early morning hours of May 12, 2010, having left the South African metropolis some hours earlier. Given its relatively young age, the aircraft's airframe had only logged just over 12,000 hours of flight time, comprising of no more than 572 complete takeoff to landing cycles. On board, given the duration of the flight at just over 8.5 hours, were a complement of 3 cockpit crew, a captain and 2 first officers, 8 cabin crew and 93 passengers of 12 nationalities, or rather 13 if one was to acknowledge the dual citizenship of one South African national, who also held an Irish passport. The vast majority, however, 71 in total, were Dutch citizens returning from vacation in South Africa, expecting to transit through Tripoli as they eventually made their way back to destinations on the European mainland. As the aircraft cruised at 40,000 feet above the Sahara Desert, approximately 1 hour and 50 before the accident, Captain Yusuf Bashir al-Saadi returned to the cockpit on completion of his rest period in the crew bunk. Age 57, his total experience extended to just over 17,000 flight hours. Taking his place once again in the left-hand seat, his relief first officer Nazim al-Mabrouk al-Tarhouni made way, moving briefly to the jump seat in the rear of the cockpit. Al-Tarhouni, at 37, was the youngest of the 3-man cockpit crew, and also the least experienced, with a total of just under 1,900 hours of total flight time. Once the captain had settled back in and been brought up to date on developments during his absence, Al-Tarhouni moved into the right-hand seat, allowing First Officer Tariq Musa Abu al-Shawazi as pilot flying a final opportunity to take a break, prior to the crew collectively preparing for the approach into Tripoli. At 42, al-Shawashi had amassed a total of just over 4,200 hours. With regard all three pilots, given the relatively recent introduction of the A330 type into the Afriqiyah Fleet, none had much more than 500 hours each on the type. None expected the approach into Tripoli to be anything other than routine. Looking at the forecast weather for their arrival, the very worst they could expect was a little bit of light early morning mist, not uncommon for this part of the world, which shouldn't reduce visibility generally to anything less than about 5 kilometers or 3 miles, with a light scattered cloud cover to develop only later, some hours after their scheduled arrival. Now to the south of the airport and just 30 minutes from touchdown, Afriqiyah 771 was positively identified by Tripoli's Air Traffic Control Centre. For standard procedure, the aircraft was instructed to squawk a unique 4-digit transponder code of 4032 and cleared to proceed direct to a 10-mile final for runway 09, where the crew could expect to shoot the locator, or more commonly referred to as the NDB approach, the minimum weather requirements for which would be a cloud base of no lower than 350 feet and a visibility of 1,600 metres or 1 mile, neither of which, given the reported conditions, would be in any way problematic. These types of instrument approaches are, by definition, non-precision in nature, meaning that unlike their more familiar ILS cousins, the lateral guidance provided to the pilot is rather rudimentary in nature, being susceptible to error and interference, whereas vertical guidance is completely non-existent. What I mean by this is that in order to fly the correct vertical profile for a locator or NDB approach, the pilot must make reference to a navigation chart and subsequently position the aircraft manually in order to comply with any published altitude crossing restrictions. Thus, when compared to an ILS approach which provides the pilot with both accurate lateral and vertical guidance, execution of a non-precision approach becomes a far more challenging and labour-intensive exercise, with a correspondingly higher potential for error on the part of the crew. In truth, given the option, most pilots would avoid having to fly them at all, although admittedly things have improved considerably with introduction of modern-day flight management computers, or FMCs. Specifically with regard to the Airbus types, once the intended non-precision approach has been selected from the menu of available approaches in the FMC, the autopilot, once correctly configured, has the ability to fly both the lateral and vertical profiles to a much higher degree of accuracy than could be expected of the average pilot, thereby greatly reducing the cockpit workload and improving overall flight safety. To use the correct Airbus terminology, under such circumstances the approach is said to be managed. That is to say that both the lateral and vertical profiles are being managed by the software of the flight management computer through direct manipulation of the aircraft's automated systems, namely the autopilot and autothrust. Given the 330's level of sophistication, most flying tasks can be accomplished in a variety of different ways, and execution of the non-precision approach is just one such example. Although the managed option I've outlined here is indeed the preferred option for executing these types of approaches, it's not the only option available to the pilot. Without going into any huge level of detail, certain environmental or operational circumstances may preclude adoption of this managed approach, not least of which is the fact that the approach concerned may not actually be stored in the aircraft's database. Under these circumstances, the option of flying the approach through the aircraft's automated systems, although still present, does require the pilot to now take over responsibility from the flight management computer with regard to the aircraft's lateral and vertical trajectories, so as to ensure that minimum crossing altitudes as published on the respective approach charts are complied with. Again, to use the correct terminology, approaches flown in this manner are termed selected approaches. In selecting the approach, the pilot rather than the flight management computer must now assume responsibility for defining the specific track that the aircraft will fly laterally over the ground, while at an appropriate time define a corresponding flight path angle, or FPA, typically a 3-degree incline to the horizon, which will have the aircraft maintain a constant descent gradient all the way to touchdown. In so doing, although the autopilot and autothrust are still technically flying the aircraft, It's the pilot that provides input to these automated systems as to how the approach should be flown, rather than the onboard navigation computer. To potentially complicate things still further, having highlighted the existence of both managed and selected approaches, a third commonly adopted alternative is to fly a combination of the two, a hybrid if you'd like, where the flight management computer will oversee the lateral requirements of the approach, while at the same time the pilot will directly manipulate its vertical requirements. In such circumstances, the approach is now said to be managed laterally and selected vertically. The reason I'm attempting to clarify all the potential options available is because the fundamental philosophy behind what the aircraft is attempting to do differs greatly between the managed and selected options. Without a clear understanding and active monitoring of what the aircraft's actually doing, the potential for genuine confusion on the flight deck is very real. Confusion which can have potentially devastating consequences. Yet in reality, however, the full story behind Afriqiyah 771 didn't merely revolve around the events of May 12th, but rather actually began some 2 weeks beforehand on the afternoon of April 28th. That afternoon, this same crew, flying this same aircraft down the same NDAB approach to the same runway in Tripoli, in admittedly more inclement weather conditions, were involved in an incident which bore a significant resemblance to the events which were about to befall 771. On the approach that afternoon, the crew initially adopted the hybrid technique, before finally reverting to the fully selected technique using the track FPA modes. Of importance was the fact that the aircraft's descent from the platform altitude of 1400 feet was commenced prematurely, about 2 nautical miles before the Tango Whiskey beacon, resulting in the aircraft crossing it about 400 feet lower than it actually should have. With no visual contact of the runway environment, the approach was ultimately discontinued in what can only be described as a disorganized, chaotic, and incompetent mess, which resulted in multiple pitch oscillations, dual simultaneous inputs on both side sticks, uncoordinated thrust lever movement, 2 flap over speeds, and triggering of the ground proximity warning system. A less than impressive performance, to say the very least. Under such circumstances, an airline with a robust safety management system and promoting a just culture would have encouraged, indeed expected, its pilots to have reported themselves, so that firstly they be provided without jeopardy any remedial training which might be deemed necessary in order to better manage similar situations going forward, but also secondly so that anonymously their peers might benefit from hearing of their experience. Captain Al-Saadi, however, filed no such report with the company, nor was the relevant flight data information downloaded by the company's safety office, meaning that the crew's operational deficiencies had gone completely unnoticed, and as a result they had continued to operate the line as if nothing had ever happened. And history would suggest that handling errors like these, left uncorrected, are bound to be repeated. From their position in the tower some 28 metres and 90 feet above the airport infrastructure, the 3 controllers on duty in the tower on the morning of May 12th had a bird's eye view of all traffic movements across the airfield, with its 2 intersecting runways orientated perpendicularly north-south, east-west, the latter, runway 09 at 3,600 metres in length, the equivalent of 11,800 feet, being the designated active runway for all arrivals and departures. They had observed and reported the current conditions at the field to be calm, with a visibility of 6 kilometres or 3 3/4 miles, under clear skies and a surface temperature of 19 degrees centigrade. That being the case, given the inherent complexity, general inaccuracy and invariably higher workloads associated with all non-precision approaches, they had proactively taken the initiative to query the area and approach controllers as to whether it would be more prudent and appropriate to switch the active runway to the reciprocal end, that being runway 27. Indeed, whatever light winds existed at the time actually favoured runway 27, and it was serviced with an ILS, an approach aid which would certainly make the arriving pilots' lives a hell of a lot easier. The request, however, had fallen on deaf ears, not least because mistakenly the approach controller believed the ILS to be off the air for routine maintenance, and given the number of arrivals at the time, there was no appetite to reshuffle this inbound sequence to facilitate a runway change which, in their view, wasn't altogether necessary. And so 771's clearance to proceed towards the final approach for runway 09 remained unchanged. Al-Saadi acknowledged the clearance and subsequently requested descent. On their second radio set, the crew made contact with Afriqiyah Operations to inform them that their estimated arrival time for Tripoli would now be 6:05 in the morning local, just as the dawn was breaking, and that the total passenger count on board was 93. Over the next number of minutes, the Libyan controller was heard to juggle the descent speeds of not only 771, but also 3 other aircraft, all converging on Tripoli at more or less the same time. Of the 4, 771 would be the second in sequence to an Afriqiyah Airways Flight 721, just ahead of it. In order to schedule a deceleration of the aircraft's speed and subsequent reconfiguration for the approach, Captain Al-Saadi activated the approach phase through the MACDU and called for the first stage of flaps to be selected. Somewhat belatedly, and obviously having not been discussed earlier, as the aircraft descended into the terminal area, Al-Saadi suggested to his first officer that perhaps the approach should be flown using the managed technique, a suggestion which Al-Shawashi was apparently happy to accept. Just 6 seconds later, the approach controller cleared 771 for the locator approach to runway 09, with the crew continuing to slow and reconfigure the aircraft as it turned to the right in order to establish on the extended centerline. Al-Saadi called out track FPA as a prompt to his first officer to select the alternative flight director presentation more appropriate to the conduct of these non-precision type approaches, with Al-Shawashi indicating that he would do so once established inbound to the runway. Now successfully aligned with the landing runway ahead, Al-Saadi again prompted his first officer to make the necessary outstanding selections, so as to allow the flight management computer guide the autopilot down the approach. Al-Shawashi obliged by depressing the approach button on the flight control unit, which immediately caused the autopilot's lateral commanded mode to shift into approach nav, indicating that the lateral element of the approach was now being managed by the flight management computer, with the associated managed vertical mode indicating an arm status in anticipation of the aircraft's interception of the FMC's computed descent profile. Finally, just 2 minutes and 16 seconds before the accident, 771 was handed over to the tower controller at a distance of just under 7 nautical miles, that's 13 kilometers or 8 statute miles from touchdown, while maintaining 1400 feet, the platform altitude from which the approach would be commenced. The tower controller instructed the crew to continue the approach and to report when they had the runway in sight. Up until this point, despite the fact that arguably more thought and preparation should have been put into exactly how the approach was going to be flown, things had progressed largely without incident. But that was about to change, and pretty quickly. Just 4 seconds later, despite the collective intention having been to fly the approach using the managed technique, without warning, Al-Shawashi unilaterally deviated from what had been their apparent plan, and instead selected and engaged a flight path angle of -3 degrees. What this actually did was to revise the approach format from the planned managed profile to the hybrid profile I mentioned earlier, whereby the lateral element was now being governed by the flight management computer, while the vertical profile had now become the sole responsibility of the pilot. This in itself was not necessarily a bad thing, other than the fact that the unilateral change of plan would have done nothing other than introduce confusion to the flight deck. But significantly, in engaging the flight path angle mode when he did, at a distance of 1.3 nautical miles from the Tango Whiskey locator, Al-Shawashi had prematurely started the 330's descent from 1400 feet, and this was significant and potentially extremely dangerous. In engaging this alternative vertical mode, Al-Shawashi, per procedure, had in fact articulated the change, with the philosophy being that such articulation on the part of the pilot flying is designed to keep the whole crew aware and informed of what the aircraft's actually doing. Had his first officer's comments resonated with Al-Saadi, perhaps he would have intervened and corrected the aircraft's premature descent. But in a brutal twist of fate, the captain of the preceding aircraft, Afriqiyah 721, which had just landed, called Al-Saadi over the radio by name in order to warn him about the presence of low stratus cloud or fog banks on the latter part of the approach, a change in conditions which hadn't been flagged by the controllers.
يوسف،
دوينا
فقط لمعلوماتك، لقد شهدنا الكثير من السحب المنخفضة والضباب في النهائيات القصيرة، ولم نحصل على الأضواء إلا على ارتفاع حوالي 400 قدم.
Al-Saadi, in acknowledging the radio call from 721, had initially replied with a simple yes, which, given the unfortunate timing of the exchange, may have incorrectly been taken by Al-Shawashi as an endorsement of his action to select a flight path angle of -3 degrees. The truth, however, was that Al-Saadi was now becoming preoccupied with the unexpected change in meteorological conditions, and had simply failed to recognise what his first officer had done. In fact, the oversight was not his alone. From his position in the jump seat to the rear of the cockpit, the relief first officer had likewise failed to notice what was happening. As the aircraft's descent continued, it passed overhead the Tango Whiskey locator, not at the published altitude of 1,400 feet, but rather 1,020, nearly 400 feet low on the required profile. Yet nobody on the flight deck of 771 seemed to notice. In contrast, Al-Saadi instead focused on informing the tower controller that he was now in final approach, and requested a conditional clearance to land once visual acquisition of the runway environment had been achieved. 9 seconds later, that clearance was forthcoming. As the aircraft descended through 720 feet, a synthetic voice called out, "100 above," drawing the crew's attention to the fact that the aircraft was now closing in on the published minimum descent altitude, or MDA, for the approach. The MDA is a hard altitude, descent below which is prohibited unless the landing runway is clearly in sight. However, having descended prematurely and thus potentially compromised obstacle clearance on the approach, 771 was now about to reach the MDA geographically at a point further away from the runway threshold than it actually should have been, and given the reducing visibility, this certainly would have not improved their chances of visually acquiring the landing runway in sufficient time to allow the approach be continued. With 100 feet still to go, Al-Saadi called out, "Continue," as he desperately searched ahead for any sign of the runway environment. With still nothing to be seen, this is not what he had been expecting. Descending at nearly 700 feet per minute, a mere 6 seconds later the MDA was reached, 620 feet above sea level, or the equivalent of just 360 feet above the ground. The aircraft was now 2 nautical miles from the runway threshold, whereas it should have been only 1. This extra distance, plus the reducing visibility, conspired to keep the runway hidden from view. The rules under such circumstances are clear and unambiguous. Yet, in displaying an incredible lack of assertiveness and personal initiative, instead of terminating the approach as he was obliged to do, Al-Shawashi instead looked to his captain for direction. Al-Saadi appeared to hesitate, and this momentary hesitation was all that was needed in order for the 330 to compromise the envelope of its ground proximity warning system.
Too low, terrain.
As its synthetic voice called out, "Too low, terrain," Al-Saadi was finally stunned into action. Flight Crew Operations Manual guidance at the time instructed the crew that with the generation of a too low terrain GPWS caution, they were to adjust the aircraft's flight path, or more appropriately in this case, initiate a go-around without delay. This required the crew to immediately rotate the aircraft to a 15-degree nose-up attitude, either by use of the autopilot or manually, whilst at the same time simultaneously applying maximum available power by pushing both thrust levers as far forward as possible into the toga detent, allowing the aircraft to climb safely away. Regrettably, for all those on board, however, this wasn't what actually happened. Within 30 seconds, Afriqiyah 771 would be a burning wreck in the Libyan desert. Yet the events which would bring the 330 to its grave would prove to be anything but straightforward, and would ultimately come to highlight the fragility of human physiology. with the aircraft having reached a minimum height above the ground of 280 feet. In response to Al-Saadi's startled command to go around, Al-Shawashi had disengaged the autopilot and made direct inputs on a side stick over the next 3-second period, so as to increase the aircraft's pitch attitude from its current 2 degrees of nose up to just over 12. This rotation, as well as actually failing to reach the required 15-degree pitch target for a normal go-around, was conducted at a somewhat pedestrian rate given the aircraft's proximity to the ground beneath. Yet the aircraft had started to climb away and gain altitude, nearly 130 feet to be exact, climbing back through the MDA until reaching a maximum altitude of 670 feet above sea level, or just over 400 feet above the ground, before suddenly this rate of climb began to rapidly decay, ultimately turning into a descent, a mere 3 seconds after the go-around had been commenced. The reason behind the aircraft's dramatic change of trajectory wasn't due to any environmental factor, nor was it the result of a depleting energy state, as Al-Shawashi had applied full go-around power, but rather what the flight data recorder would categorically show was a forward input by Al-Shawashi on his side stick, forcing the aircraft's nose to drop, initially reducing the established rate of climb, before actually reversing it. At the same time he was making this input on his side stick, cockpit voice recordings would later recall Al-Shawashi's apparent fixation with having the aircraft reconfigured, both flap and landing gear. His initial nose-down inputs were commenced just 3 seconds after initiation of the go-around, yet maintained incredibly for a full 21 seconds in total, with the effect being the reduction in the aircraft's pitch attitude from just over 12 degrees nose up to nearly 3.5 degrees nose down, at which point the aircraft had descended to just 524 feet above sea level, or 260 feet above the ground. As it did so, the ground proximity warning systems don't sink, too low terrain and pull-up warnings triggered in quick succession, now just 3 seconds before impact. As if suddenly alerted to the impending danger, Al-Saadi took control of the aircraft by pushing and holding the red priority takeover push button atop his side stick. But incredibly, with this action having effectively neutralized his first officer's side stick inputs, instead of attempting to make any counter input to arrest the aircraft's rate of descent, instead Al-Saadi did the exact opposite, making an abrupt and sharp forward nose-down input of his own. Al-Shawashi, who had up until now been making a nose-down input on his side stick, suddenly reversed this input, most probably in response to, or at least as an involuntary reaction to the GPWS's repeated activation. Yet given the fact that Al-Saadi had just neutralized his first officer's side stick inputs, Al-Shawashi's actions would count for nothing. The captain alone was now in control of the jet. A 771 plunged towards the desert sands below. The last act recorded on the 330's flight data recorder was a sudden, sharp and desperate rearward movement of the left-hand side stick. With just 1 second to impact, most probably coincident with the aircraft's appearance from the low-level cloud layer, it appears that Al-Saadi had finally grasped the predicament that they were in, and desperately tried to avoid what was now the inevitable. At 6:01 and 14 seconds, Afriqiyah 771 impacted the ground just outside the airport's boundary fence, approximately 1,200 metres or 4,000 feet short of the runway 09 threshold, and 150 metres or 500 feet to the south of its extended centreline. The aircraft's orientation at impact, that being wings horizontal, gear retracted, and an almost level pitch attitude, resulted in its soft underbelly making contact with the ground first, scattering debris over a rectangular area almost 800 metres long by 90 metres wide, the equivalent of 2,600 feet by 300. An Alitalia flight, holding short of runway 09 and awaiting departure, reported seeing 771 appear from the low cloud layer with an extremely high rate of descent before impacting the ground, with the tail section separating almost immediately as it bounced across the ground a number of times. Although the impact site was largely uninhabited, a sandy plain dotted with trees, Parts of the aircraft did nonetheless damage several electricity poles in the area, a step-down transformer, a nearby mosque and a house, the occupants of which, a married couple and their 5 children, being lucky to escape without injury. But for the passengers and crew of Afriqiyah 771, however, their fate was not to be so fortunate, with the force of the impact and post-impact fire completely destroying the 330 and taking the lives of all on board, with the exception of one 9-year-old Dutch boy, Ruben van Nassau, who had been returning from safari with his parents and brother aged 11, all of whom perished. Initially he was taken to Sabia's hospital, 30 kilometres and 19 miles southeast of Tripoli, before being transferred to Al-Qahra in Tripoli itself, in order to receive emergency surgery for multiple fractures to both legs. 3 days after the accident on May 15th, he was finally transferred by air ambulance to Eindhoven in the Netherlands, accompanied on the flight by his aunt and uncle. On that same morning, a manifest of the deceased passengers was released and sent to the relevant embassies. In conjunction, Afriqiyah issued a statement saying that relatives of the victims who wished to visit Libya would be transported and accommodated at the airline's expense. For their part, the Libyan authorities relaxed certain passport restrictions and guaranteed the granting of visas. Later that afternoon, the airline opened a family assistance centre in a hotel in Tripoli to care for family members and relatives of crash victims who had decided to travel to the country. The CEO and chairperson of the board met family members at the hotel, while those wishing to visit the crash site were allowed to do so, where they placed flowers and said their last farewells. The first non-Libyan passenger was repatriated to the Netherlands on May 27th, 15 days after the accident, with the last of the deceased being flown home on June 15th. The Libyan Civil Aviation Authority immediately opened an investigation into the accident, with Airbus providing full technical assistance through the French Investigation Authority, the BEA. In addition, given their specific interests in the accident, both the South African Civil Aviation Authority and the Dutch Safety Board also sent representatives in order to assist with the investigation. Both the flight data and cockpit voice recorders were quickly removed from the crash site and transported to Paris for detailed examination. Once opened, what became clear from the very outset was the fact that the aircraft had manifested no technical malfunction or difficulties in advance of the impact, nor from the cockpit voice transcripts did it appear that there had been any emergency on the flight deck which may have been a contributing factor. That said, however, aspects of how the crew had interacted and conducted themselves did give rise to some concern, specifically in the areas of workload management, procedural application, communication, and a general overall level of situational awareness. Largely, events on the flight deck had passed without incident or comment, up until the point where the crew had begun to prepare for the approach and landing into Tripoli. Given the fact that this was the crew's home base, and that both forecast and indeed reported weather conditions for the airport were relatively benign, the crew had elected to conduct a short or abbreviated approach briefing, which simply reviewed the expected landing runway type of approach to be flown, in this case the locator or NDB approach, and the desired auto brake setting for deceleration after touchdown. Although such practice wasn't prohibited per Afriqiyah standard operating procedures, in simply making reference to the expected landing runway and approach type, the crew had failed to conduct any detailed or meaningful evaluation of exactly how the approach would actually be flown, be that managed, selected, or a hybrid combination of both. And given the potential complexities involved, the investigation team were of the opinion that this amounted to a significant oversight on the crew's part, This lack of a shared mental model as to how events were to be managed soon became apparent as the crew began to configure the 330 for the initial and intermediate approach segments. At 5:57 and 35 seconds, just 3 minutes 39 seconds before impact, as 771 prepared to establish on the extended centerline of the approach, Al-Saadi's comment to his first officer of, "Let's do it, what's the name? It's better, nav approach. It's approved, as you know," was most probably an invitation to Al-Shawashi to fly the approach using the fully managed technique. But in doing so, his choice of phraseology was somewhat non-standard and thus potentially ambiguous, indicating perhaps even for him a lack of complete understanding as to how exactly such approaches were to be conducted. Any potential unfamiliarity on his part may well have been explained by way of the fact that prior to his employment with Afriqiyah, Al-Saadi had flown not only with Libyan Arab Airlines, but also Nouvelle Air, an A320 operator based out of Tunisia. Although the automation philosophy is common between the A320 and 330 types, procedurally, Nouvelle Air had implemented a policy whereby all non-precision approaches such as these were to be conducted exclusively using the selected approach technique, meaning that Al-Saadi most probably had less experience of conducting these managed approaches than his 17,000 hours of total flight time might have otherwise suggested. Al-Shawashi's simple response of yes, okay, given the manner in which Al-Saadi had tried to express himself, meant the investigation team believed possibly one of two things. Either he understood the captain's intention was to conduct the approach completely managed, with both lateral and vertical navigation being controlled through the flight management computer, or, alternatively, that he wished the approach to be flown vertically selected and laterally managed, in other words, by way of the hybrid technique which we've discussed previously. The investigation team believed that given the lack of discussion prior to commencement of the approach in relation to the handling technique to be used, Al-Saadi's prompting of his first officer to select the track FPA presentation of the flight director display may instead have been interpreted by his subordinate as a change of heart and a belated preference to have the approach actually conducted in a selected manner both laterally and vertically. This hypothesis was supported further by Al-Shawasi's subsequent response of, "I'll do it when established," an unnecessary delay in selecting the alternative flight director display, if indeed that's what had been understood, but a delay which, in a completely different context, would certainly go a long way towards explaining the first officer's subsequent actions. Al-Saadi's further prompting of his first officer to again give it to the approach now, most probably the investigators believed was an instruction on his part for his first officer to finally push the approach push button on the flight control unit, signaling the crew's intention for the flight management computer to oversee the approach profiles, both laterally and vertically, from here on in. The aircraft was now established on the extended centerline of the runway, at a distance of about 7 nautical miles, that being 8 statute miles or the equivalent of 13 kilometres from the runway threshold, and at an altitude of 1,400 feet above sea level, the published altitude from which the final descent would commence. Having pressed the approach push button, the arming of the managed vertical mode in anticipation of the aircraft's final descent from the platform altitude was observed and articulated by Al-Shawashi in the right-hand seat. These exchanges between the two pilots, as well as the selections made, the call-outs and the guidance mode displayed on the FMA, suggest that at least at this moment in time, both captain and first officer shared the same mental model of where the aircraft was and what their expectations were. With the aircraft configured, Al-Shawashi called for the landing checklist. However, its completion was interrupted by the unexpected radio call from the captain of Afriqiyah 721, which had just landed. Through an unfortunate coincidental sequence of events, it was at exactly this moment, while Al-Saadi was distracted by 721's comments in relation to visibility on the approach, that the first officer selected and engaged the vertical flight path angle mode. Why he did so will never be known for sure. However, the investigation team surmised that it was plausible that his actions may have demonstrated either a genuine misunderstanding of the approach procedure itself, or confusion as to what al-Saadi's expectation of him actually was. Significantly, however, although the reversion to a selected vertical mode wasn't in itself dangerous, the geographic point on the approach at which al-Shawashi had engaged the mode most certainly was. An elevation view of the published descent profile for the locator approach clearly stipulates that descent from the platform altitude of 1400 feet should be commenced as the aircraft passes overhead the Tango Whiskey navigation beacon. The Tango Whiskey beacon, as it happens, is exactly 5.2 nautical miles from the Tripoli VOR DME navigation beacon located on the airfield, and being extremely familiar with the local procedures, a figure which presumably would have been well known to all the Afriqiyah crews. This figure of 5.2 is significant because in error, al-Shawashi, in engaging the flight path angle mode when he did, initiated the descent from 1400 feet at a distance of 5.2 nautical miles, not from the Tripoli VOR, but rather from the runway threshold of 09. And the problem here is that both are not co-located. Commencing descent at 5.2 nautical miles from the runway actually meant that the jet had started its descent prematurely, 1.3 nautical miles too early to be exact, meaning that at a fixed flight path angle of -3 degrees, the 330 would now fly a lower parallel trajectory by a not insignificant 400 feet. This coincidental figure of 5.2 meant it likely that al-Shawashi had simply mixed the two figures up, but there was also the possibility that he had just inadvertently engaged the mode after initially selecting the desired value of -3 degrees, a muscle memory reaction as it's often referred to. This would have necessitated him rotating the selector to obtain the desired value, and then simply pulling the selector knob towards him ever so slightly, in order to have the selection engaged. It really was that simple. The significant issue was, however, that the error having been made, neither of the other two pilots on the flight deck had noticed, even despite the fact that al-Shawashi had actually articulated what he had done. Undoubtedly was believed by the investigation team that al-Saadi and relief pilot al-Tarhuni's collective inattention was due to the distraction which the call from Afriqiyah 721 had given rise to. Somewhat ironic given that the previous flight of April 28 had also descended prematurely, and one would have assumed that al-Saadi would have been monitoring proceedings extremely closely so as to ensure against any such repetition. Yet this obviously isn't what happened. As the descent continued, the aircraft subsequently did pass the Tango Whiskey beacon, but not at the 1400 feet as published on the approach chart, but rather at 1020 feet, nearly 400 feet lower than it should have been. Yet still, nothing out of the ordinary had resonated with anybody on the flight deck. It would appear that given the comments made by the captain of Afriqiyah 721, the collective psyche of the crew was not focused on the present, but rather what potentially lay ahead in the near future, with al-Shawahi being aware of the selection he had made. Al-Saadi's assumption that the original approach plan was still valid highlighted the fact that a common shared understanding between the two pilots as to what the aircraft was actually doing no longer existed, with the aircraft's synthetic voice calling out 100 above, indicating the aircraft's proximity now to the fast approaching minimum descent altitude. Al-Shawashi called out, "You see?" in the hope that al-Saadi would confirm that visual acquisition of the runway environment had been achieved. But it hadn't, and al-Saadi simply instructed his first officer to continue. The basis for his decision was due most probably to the fact that he was still optimistic that visual reference would be acquired within the next few seconds, given what he still believed to be the aircraft's optimal descent profile. Furthermore, the fact that 721 had experienced the same conditions yet nonetheless landed safely only a short time beforehand would have only acted to reinforce this expectation of how things would likely play out, and undoubtedly this was the outcome he wanted and would push to achieve, given that aborting the landing would have meant making a new plan of action, a costly process from a cognitive perspective, particularly in view of the long through-the-night flight they had just undertaken. The reality, however, was that given the 330's premature descent, it was now more than a full nautical mile, 1.9 kilometres or just under 1.2 statuette miles, further from the landing runway than it should have been. And given the deterioration in visibility, this was going to make visual contact with the runway all the more difficult. On reaching the minimum descent altitude of 620 feet, just 360 feet above the ground, the aircraft's synthetic voice made another call out: minimums. Perhaps assuming that the captain had acquired visual reference with the runway environment. Contrary to all the rules, Al-Shawashi continued the descent below NDA, while at the same time looking for guidance from his captain, without eliciting any immediate reply. His hesitation in conducting the missed approach without the explicit approval of his captain was suggestive the investigation team believed that crew resource management or CRM principles had not been fully implemented. One of these principles is that although the captain is the senior member of the crew and bears ultimate responsibility for the entire operation, other crew members should feel at liberty to contribute their own opinions and suggestions, and most certainly the freedom to demonstrate a level of personal initiative. Almost instantaneously, given the aircraft's unexpected geographic positioning, the ground proximity warning system fired off the first of multiple cautions and warnings. Too low terrain, with the synthetic voice undoubtedly taking Al-Saadi by surprise and shocking him into action with his subsequent command to Al-Shawashi to execute a missed approach. To his credit, Al-Shawashi's response to his captain's command was instantaneous and without delay. Although unnecessary, given Airbus guidance at the time, his subsequent disconnection of the autopilot was most probably as a reflex reaction to activation of the GPWS caution. At this stage, it would be fair to say that both pilots shared a common cognitive model as to what was required and what the aircraft was actually doing. Yet in the blink of an eye, all that was about to change. It became obvious quite quickly that Al-Saadi had been unsettled by a turn of events which most likely he had convinced himself weren't actually going to happen. Repeatedly, he failed to make the mandatory go-around call-outs of the monitoring pilot, specifically with regard to aircraft configuration, and more importantly deviations from the correct missed approach trajectory, and it was these deviations in particular which would ultimately seal the aircraft's fate. Just 3 seconds after initiation of the go-around, Al-Shawashi had started to make forward nose-down inputs on his side stick, resulting in the aircraft's rate of climb shallowing before finally transitioning into a descent. The reason for this counterintuitive action, and the crux of what was to befall Afriqiyah 771, was the investigation team believed a perceptual disorientation on his part, specifically known as a somatographic illusion. For sure, the human body is a wonder of nature, but the reality is that it was never designed for flying. Thus, under certain dynamic flight conditions, the body's inherent physiological weaknesses are often brought to the fore, and somatographic illusion is just one such example. The body senses movement and balance using the vestibular system in the inner ear. This system has tiny canals filled with fluid, and with tiny hairs resting in the canals. When we move, the fluid moves, which subsequently causes these hairs to move as well, and this sends a signal to the brain telling us which way we are actually moving. But here's the catch. This fluid in the ear can't differentiate between the force we feel when accelerating longitudinally, that is forward in a straight line, and the force we feel from gravity when we tilt our heads backwards. In both cases, the fluid moves in the same way. So, as Al-Shawashi applied go-around thrust, the aircraft had rapidly started to accelerate, and given the fact that his initial nose-up input on the side stick was reasonably modest, the vast majority of this acceleration was acting in a longitudinal direction, which was falsely interpreted by his brain as the aircraft pitching nose-up. In fact, such was the magnitude of the illusion that Al-Shawashi's brain had been falsely tricked into thinking that the aircraft had pitched up excessively, and his resultant forward input on the side stick was thus a subconscious physical attempt to correct this false sensation. To stand any chance of overcoming the sensation once it's taken hold, the pilot needs to either have a clear view of the horizon in front of him, which given the circumstances was impossible, or trust implicitly in his aircraft's flight instrumentation. This procedurally was the responsibility of the pilot monitoring, in this case Al-Saadi, but given all that was happening, he had become completely overwhelmed and unable to appreciate the predicament they were in. While al-Saadi struggled to effectively monitor what the aircraft was doing, al-Shawashi's successive call-outs to have the flaps retracted were probably due to his detection of the red and black stripe presentation on the aircraft's speed tape, representing the maximum limiting speed for the current configuration, which, given the magnitude of the aircraft's longitudinal acceleration, were approaching at lightning speed. His fixation in this regard was quite possibly rooted in his previous experience of April 28th, where these limiting speeds were exceeded on 2 separate occasions, as the crew attempted to execute a missed approach under circumstances not terribly different from those they found themselves in now. But being fixated on the aircraft's speed and resultant configuration, it strongly suggests that al-Shawashi was thus failing to adequately monitor the aircraft's pitch and resultant trajectory. In fact, it's true to say that at no time during or following the initiation of the go-around had al-Shawashi correctly monitored the aircraft's attitude or attempted to follow the flight director's guidance. His focus on the speed tape can be explained not only by a desire to avoid the flap limiting speeds, but also by a suspected state of fatigue, given the fact that the crew had just flown 2 successive through-the-night flights. Such fatigue can naturally manifest itself in one's tendency to focus on a single point, especially, strangely enough, if coloured red, as was the case with this particular presentation. Having reached a maximum altitude of 670 feet or 400 feet above the ground, al-Shawashi's initial pitch-up inputs, then pitch-down, had, the flight data recorder revealed, been mimicked by al-Saadi in the left-hand seat, but to an extent which was not sufficient to generate the dual input oral alert, indicative of the fact that both pilots were attempting to fly the aircraft simultaneously through their respective side sticks. Examining the data, the investigation team thus concluded that not only al-Shawashi, but obviously al-Saadi as well, had succumbed to the very same spatial disorientation. Like his first officer, al-Saadi's attention seemed to be focused on the speed tape. As the aircraft accelerated through 176 knots and well into the overspeed range, he had attempted to intervene and command the autothrust to slow the aircraft down, a completely futile exercise given that with the 330, go-around power application is incompatible with autothrust activation, and so nothing actually happened. Still feeling the effects of this spatial disorientation, al-Shawashi's continued nose-down inputs caused the aircraft's rate of descent to rapidly increase. As the aircraft descended through the MDA for the second time, the ground proximity warning system sounded yet again, this time with greater urgency. Don't sink. Too low terrain. Pull up. Pull up. With the situation rapidly getting out of control and both pilots now acting as independent units rather than a cohesive team, with generation of the don't sink alert, al-Saadi applied a sharp nose-down input on his side stick, the complete opposite to what the alert was suggesting he should be doing, and 1 second later pressed his side stick priority push button, which had the effect of neutralising side stick inputs from his first officer. Why he should have behaved in such a way is open to conjecture, but the investigation team were of the opinion that the very act of moving his head while adjusting both the speed setting on the FCU and reconfiguring the flaps most probably had the effect of worsening the somatographic sensation he was obviously experiencing. Whether al-Saadi's action of pressing his side stick priority push button was done with intent or an involuntary reaction to the circumstances couldn't be established for sure. The former, given the rapidly changing circumstances, couldn't be ruled out. However, his seemingly involuntary activation of the side stick push-to-talk switch only moments later, described as a potential spasm in the final report, meant that the latter couldn't be conclusively ruled out either. In fact, although the flight data recorder indicated that the left-hand priority push button had been depressed for a continuous 3 seconds, a historical, reoccurring technical problem with the button meant that even if pressed momentarily, it tended to take a number of seconds for it to release completely. Why this apparently trivial matter is important lies in the fact that in response to the don't sink alert, al-Shawashi had actually ceased making nose-down inputs on his side stick, and instead had started to command a nose-up input, with movement of his side stick to the aft stop. But, given the fact that al-Saadi's takeover push button was still depressed for whatever reason, his inputs, although now appropriate for the circumstances they found themselves in, would amount to nothing. The normal priority left synthetic call-out which this act would normally have generated, thus alerting al-Shawashi to what was actually happening with the aircraft, was however unfortunately masked by the simultaneous generation of the higher priority GPWS warning. Finally, at a height of just 180 feet above the ground and less than 2 seconds before both the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recordings simultaneously ceased, al-Sahadi suddenly reversed his inputs on the left-hand side stick and belatedly attempted to force the aircraft into a climb, before again inexplicably commanding a descent. The lack of an appropriate crew response to activation of the GPWS warning resulted in the aircraft striking the ground more than a kilometre short of the runway 09 threshold at a speed of 260 knots and a rate of descent approaching 4,500 feet per minute. The investigation team ultimately believed that the probable cause of the accident was the lack of a common action plan during the approach, with the latter part of the approach being continued below the minimum descent altitude without ground visual reference having been acquired. Furthermore, they assessed that there were inappropriate application of flight control inputs during the go-around and following the activation of the ground proximity warning. And finally, as a crew, the lack of monitoring and controlling of the aircraft's flight path. It was deemed that these events could be explained by the fact that crew resource management was deficient during the approach and degraded further still during the go-around. This degradation probably being amplified by numerous radio communications during the final approach and the crew's general state of fatigue. With regard to the pilot's inputs on their respective side sticks, these actions were typical of those historically observed as a result of stomographic perceptual illusions. Furthermore, although not directly attributable to the actual cause of the accident, the investigation team nonetheless cited the following as being contributing factors. Firstly, that the weather report available to the crew did not reflect the actual weather experienced during the final segments of the approach. And secondly, given the crew's poor management of the go-around of this and the previous flight of April 28th, the standard of training being delivered by the company was deemed to be inadequate. Overall, 21 safety recommendations were made on foot of the final report. Amongst others, the airport authority was urged to upgrade the facilities for runway 09 by installing an ILS approach aid on that end. Airbus, the aircraft manufacturer, was encouraged to review its training courses and syllabi, ensuring sufficient emphasis be placed on go-around and emergency procedures, as well as highlighting the effects of somatographic illusion and the conditions under which this phenomenon will be most prevalent. With regard to Afriqiyah Airways themselves, recommendations were made that the airline should also ensure that the subject matter relating to somatographic illusionary phenomenon be incorporated into its pilots' recurrent training, and that the airline should review the implementation and oversight of CRM training so as to ensure that any gaps between the theory and practice on the line are identified and eradicated. With the investigation complete, site clearance commenced approximately 6 weeks after the accident on June 21st, 2010, so ending the proceedings surrounding what was officially the second deadliest air crash ever involving an Airbus A330 after the loss of Air France 447 the previous year. Afriqiyah Airways Flight number 771 was permanently retired from service following the disaster, bringing to a close the shocking events which took the lives of all on board bar one, a 9-year-old boy whose life would never be the same again.